Some things are so bad that just to have been near them taints you, leaves a spot of badness in your soul like a bare patch in the forest where nothing will grow. Do you suppose a story can carry away such badness? It seems a bit much to hope for, doesn't it? Maybe it's true for the little wrongs, you know? The kind of minor frustrations that you're able to turn into funny stories at parties. For what happened at the creek, though, I doubt there's such a transformation waiting. There's only transmission. And there's more to it than that. There's the tale Dan and I heard in Herman's Diner, since Howard told us what happened to Lottie Schmidt and her family some 90 years past. I've been unable to shake it. You could say his words stuck with me, which would be the understatement of the year. I can recall that tale word for word, as could Howard from the minister who told it to him. Without a doubt, part of the reason for the vividness of my memory is the way that Howard's story seems to explain a good deal of what happened to Dan and I later that same day. That tale about the building of the reservoir and who and what was covered by its waters prowls my brain. Even had we heeded Howard's advice and avoided the creek that day, hell, had we turned around and headed back home as fast as I could drive, which is what we should have done, I'm convinced what we heard would still have branded itself on my memory. Can a story haunt you? Possess you? There are times I think recounting the events of that Saturday in June is just an excuse for those more distant events to make their way out into the world once more. Again, though, I am running ahead of myself. There will be a time and a place for everything, including the story of Lottie Schmidt, her father Reinar, and the man he called Der Fischer. Let's back it all up. Let's begin with a few words about my life's great passion. Well, what I used to think of as my life's great passion. A few words about fishing. It wasn't something I'd learned as a child. My pa took me once or twice, sure, but he wasn't much good at it himself, so he concentrated on teaching me the things he knew, like baseball and the guitar. One day, it must have been 35 years after Pa and I had spent our final Saturday morning subjecting a bucket full of worms to protracted drowning, I woke up and thought I'd like to go fishing. Scratch that. I woke up and thought I need to go fishing. It needed it the deep down way you need that tall glass of water with the ice cubes clinking around in it at 3 o'clock on a blistering July afternoon. Why I needed fishing of all things, I don't know, and can't say. Granted, I was at a bit of a rough patch. My wife had just died and us not married 2 years, and I was living the cliches you watch in made-for-TV movies and listen to in country songs. Mostly, this meant drinking too much. And since Pa wasn't much with the liquor either, this meant drinking badly. Half a bottle of scotch, followed by half a bottle of wine, followed by extended sessions of holding on to the toilet as the bathroom did a merry dance around me. Hi, thanks for watching my reading review of The Fisherman by John Langan. This will be the spoiler-free portion of the reading review. If you want to watch the more in-depth spoiler version, go ahead and fast forward since now. As for the short and sweet portion of the reading review, is it worth reading? Yeah, so long as you, the reader, are in the mood for a slightly spooky book that combines elements of cosmic horror with Lovecraftian influence, that also explores the depths of the human psyche after experiencing such a monumental loss, then yeah, it's 100% for you. I personally thought that on my subjective scale of 1 to 10, that this book was a strong 6.5. A slightly above average book that scratches a sort of specific niche, you know? So with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and jump into the more in-depth spoiler version of the review. So overall, it took me about 2 weeks to finish this book. In between writing, work, and grad school, that's pretty fast for me personally. It's also pretty fair to say that this book hooked me pretty much right away. John Langan does a really excellent job of setting the scene and pulling you, the reader, into the story of Abe and Dan. From the get-go as the reader, you feel deeply entrenched in the grief and loss of these characters as they're kind of processing it. Personally, I was super invested with the themes of loss and grief and how these two characters cope with their mutual trauma of loss via their love of fishing. And suddenly this healthy escape/coping method is taken away from them and perverted in this sort of disturbing way. But where the book lost me was spending 70% of the word count in a flashback scene told via a third party that details the history of the area and gives the reader an idea as to why all of the events that are about to unfold are happening. I was very interested in the tale of Dan and Abe that we started off with initially, and sadly this sort of narrative chunk of backstory ended up being the majority of the book. And don't get me wrong, it's interesting and it's well done. I just found myself sort of loathing the time spent away from the characters who initially drew me in so well. Sort of in lieu of this lengthy history accounting alongside characters that the author really gives us no reason to take interest in. Granted, I sort of love the expanded world building the author does via the dad Reinar in this portion of the book. These parts with Reinar kind of explore the mythos and the mythology of this world and kind of delve into these strange studies he does that are very steeped in like Lovecraftian rituals and symbolism. That part was very interesting. But anything that wasn't Reinar and his fun little Lovecraftian study sessions felt a little slow. And once the book does kind of come to the end and we get back to Abe and Dan, their story feels kind of lackluster and rushed. It left me feeling like I wanted way more time and story spent on these characters being Dan and Abe and less on sort of the building of the reservoir and the history of Dutchman's Creek. By the end of the book, I was sort of scratching my head at the ending cliffhanger that left me feeling like the story didn't really take me anywhere it sort of insinuated it was going to take me. And I didn't really feel like any of the super interesting questions that were posed to me during this book got answered at all, in lieu of this kind of silly cliffhanger, other than what, I mean, overall, on my very, very subjective rating scale, with 1 being so bad that the book ruined my month, and 10 being so good that the book changed my life forever, I would give this a 6.5. For me, 6.5 stars meaning that this book was an above average read that was fun, and I would definitely recommend to anyone sort of in the market for that kind of niche itch that they want scratched. I just personally felt like I was super invested in the story of Dan and Abe, their grief, the things they experience at Dutchman's Creek, and at the end I felt like I was just left wanting a little more time with these characters and kind of fleshing them out, what they experienced. Overall, I just wanted the horror book to be about Dan and Abe, kind of like the beginning insinuates. As far as the spooky factor is concerned, I would give it a 3 out of 10. If you're an experienced horror book reader or an adept scary movie watcher, I don't think you're really going to take much horror out of this. Me personally, subjectively, it felt very scary to me, but I'm not an avid horror person. One thing that I think the book does do exceptionally well, in loads even, is giving the reader a really hard to swallow dose of reality when it comes to loss and grief and the places that can take a person physically and mentally and deep within their psyche. Really, the only thing holding this book back for me is the amount of time spent on the sort of history lesson of Dutchman's Creek. I think if the author had focused way more on the story of Dan and Abe, the characters that the reader is sort of immediately deeply invested in, this would have been a strong 8.5 out of 10 book for me. Okay, so just a quick synopsis, bullet point version of things I like and dislike about the book. Reasons I like this book. The depth of grief expressed by the characters feels authentic and is felt by the reader deeply. I think lots of people can relate to losing themselves and their hobbies, and the fear of losing the thing that brings you peace is a distressing and disturbing thing to face. That sort of just being Dan and Abe losing themselves in fishing, and it being their sort of healthy coping mechanism of dealing with their loss. And I think the idea of that healthy coping mechanism that takes you out of your grief being kind of perverted into some disturbing, perverse version of it that only adds to the distress you're feeling. Wow, that's just a really interesting way to convey that sort of terror in the book. 3. Seeing things you love turn into perverted versions of what they once were brings out a visceral, sad anger. sort of just echoing the tangent I went on there. 4. Lovecraftian stories are often silly, and this one feels good. That one just meaning, I don't think the Lovecraftian sort of subgenre of horror and cosmic horror in general get a lot of love from like good professional writers, and it was just refreshing experiencing that sort of story from a writer who does it well and takes it serious. I think often I get a little exasperated reading the works of like lesser experienced people who want to delve into Lovecraftian horror, and you get a story about Glub Glub McFlubnub, and he's the Lovecraftian outer god of silliness, and you laugh yourself to death. I'm just kind of tired of those amateur stories, and this author does the subgenre justice, and it feels intense and serious, and it feels like he honestly loves the subgenre. Okay, so things I do not like, a quick list right off my phone. I felt very invested in the story of Dan and Abe, only to be ripped out of that by accounts of what happened to Lottie Schmidt and her family. It was interesting, but I didn't enjoy falling in love with the very real story of Dan and Abe, only to spend 70% of the book on this backstory. And 4, the time we do spend with Dan and Abe felt too short. So yeah, that's just going to be a quick bullet point, kind of reiterating what I was saying, long format through this whole review. But like I said, overall, 6.5 out of 10. Super good book, really does a lot of things well, and just sort of left me wanting in the end because so much of the book was spent on backstory. Would I recommend it to someone looking for Lovecraftian horror, horror that explores the depths of grief on the human psyche? Absolutely. And if you're an avid horror reader and you feel like you're just kind of looking for something to add to that TBR, I'd throw this on there 100%. Thanks.